Good to be here today. Thankful to see each and every one of you out today. I know we have a few out sick, but we're praying the restoration upon them. With that being said, you have to pardon me because I'm going to be struggling a little bit today. For some reason, I've been burdened down with a headache today, and Amanda gave me some medicine. For those of you who saw me being lazy and not standing and singing, it wasn't because I was trying to be lazy. It was because my head was hurting, and I took some medication to ease that up, and that's doing well. But it's caused me to have my vision's a little blurry today. So if you see me squinting up to the front, it's Luke's fault because he put the text too small on the screen on the cheat sheet behind me. So blame him, take it up with him later. But anyway, starting off, this message has been on my mind really ever since we heard Brother Keith Wilson come and speak to this congregation last week. Really brought something to light and made me think about some things. And for those of you who were here, and pardon me, I'm not playing on my phone. I'm trying to use my notes on my phone that I've got stored here in my Bible app. So bear with me just a second. But for those of you who were here last week, Brother Keith Wilson talked about what he called the 3 S's with experiencing the gospel. He said first it involves searching, it involves surrender, and it involves submission. And it dawned on me as I was studying and reading through some text and studying through a book, something jumped out to me that I had never thought about before. And I'm just going to open up with these verses, which I like to throw you a curveball because I'm not going to be teaching from Romans today. But rather, this is a great platform from the basis of the message. And many of you have ever heard me talking about spiritual gifts. You'll hear me often coin a term that says something I think that we could all learn from is learning to stay in our lane when it comes to spiritual gifts. So the title of this message is actually Maintain Lane. And it's all about hearing and laboring for the kingdom of Yahweh. Because I think there's something in the 3 S's, which are very, very applicable and relevant to our life, that Brother Keith Wilson talked about last week. About first, we're talking about we have to search. We're searching the Scriptures. We're searching for eternal life. We're looking and investigating the gospel, and then there comes a time when we accept that to be true, in which we surrender to its validity. But then there's another part that he talked about, and he talked about submitting to the gospel, which is where we lay down our will for his. And I think that getting in that surrender mode is where a lot of people get hung up. And he talked about that. But I felt like that as I looked through the Scriptures, there was a particular passage that kept coming to my mind that I didn't understand why until I looked at it a second time. And I realized that I felt like that sometimes there is an obstacle, there's a stumbling block in the way between the phase of surrender and submission. And I want to read to you a passage of Scripture. Again, I opened up with Romans that you see on the screen. I at least want to mention that. It says, "For we have many parts in one body, but these parts do not all have the same function. In the same way, even though we are many, we are one in the Messiah, and individual parts connected to each other." Now, we could also go into 1 Corinthians 12, and we could talk about all these different gifts. And talks about and then he uses the analogy where he talks about, if everybody was an eye, or if everybody was an ear or a nose. And he uses the physical body. Again, he's using kind of a parable, if you will. He's using a physical example to teach us spiritual reality, that we are all different parts of one body. And on a normal human being, a normal body has 10 fingers, has 2 arms. Now, how funny would it be if our body had 6 arms and 4 fingers. It would operate very differently than it is normally designed to operate, correct? Or if we had 4 eyes and no ears, or 3 noses and no eyes. In the same way, we're all different parts of one body, and that body is to make up a whole so that it can operate at its full capacity. And I realize reading another passage of Scripture, if you want to follow along, it's in Luke chapter 10. Now, in context here, we have had in Luke chapter 9, if you're turning to Luke chapter 10, I'm trying to spare you enough time to find your place. So in Luke chapter 10 or chapter 9, he sends out the 12, and then there's several things that happen. He feeds the 5,000 people. Peter declares his faith in Yeshua. We have Yeshua predicting his death and resurrection. Yeshua's appearance is changed. We have transfiguration before them. And then toward the end of Luke 9, some of the scariest verses that I ever read that I didn't understand. And Luke 9:50, beginning of 57, talks about when Yeshua and the disciples were walking down the road. And along comes a man, comes running up to him, and he says, "I'll follow you wherever you go." And Yeshua responds very, very oddly. This man comes forward and says, "I'm going to do whatever I have to do to follow you. I'll follow you wherever you go." Whatever. In other words, he's saying, whatever you say, I'll do. And Yeshua responds by saying, "Foxes have holes. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have the nest, but the Son of Man has no place to rest." I don't know if Yeshua didn't go to all of his discipleship training classes or what, but I'm pretty sure that didn't sound like a phrase to us that would be the way you get disciples. Sounded like more he was like trying to run them off than he was to bring them in, right? But if we understand this in context, this one we kind of get. This one's relatively easy. We can kind of pick up on it when he says foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to rest. What he's saying is, are you really sure you understand what you're signing up for? Are you sure? I'm not really sure you've thought this all the way through yet. You follow me, that road may not be easy. What he says is even foxes and birds have homes. I don't. You follow me, you may not know where your next meal's coming from. You follow me, people may try to kill you. And what he's really saying to him, we can kind of grasp. He's saying, have you really thought about this through? Have you counted the cost? There's another place in Scripture where Yeshua does the same thing. He talks about how we must count the cost. So, again, this first one here, this man runs to him and says, "I'll follow you." And it almost sounds like Yeshua's trying to deter him. I don't know if you want to get into this or not. But then we read in verse 59, says he told another man, "Follow me." This time Yeshua's speaking to somebody. He says, "Hey, you, follow me." But the man replies, he says, "Master, first let me go and bury my father." That's a reasonable request, wouldn't we think in our mind? That's a reasonable thing to ask. But Yeshua responds in a very odd manner. He says, let the dead bury their own, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. That sounded very insensitive to us. I was like, man, the guy's dad just died. He says, "I'll follow you, but let me go bury my father." But the reality is that was a Jewish idiom. And I learned about some of these idioms when I was in this cultural immersion when I was in Israel, that this phrase didn't mean this, let me go bury my father, didn't even mean that his dad was even sick. This was an idiom that I'm going to put it into terms that sometimes we may have used, or at least we probably heard somebody when it comes to religion. If we've ever tried to witness to somebody, very often we sometimes will be met with this. So, especially when you're younger, teenager or even young adult, let's say I'll pick on Kyle and Joyce's age. Sometimes because they're, not too far out of college, say, hey, have you thought about giving your life? Do you go to church anywhere? And they say, well, I'm going to go. And I'm not really put a lot of thought into that. Yeah, I went to church when I was a kid, but, I'm going to college. I'm going to secure my degree. I'm going to get all the things laid out, get my financial portfolio laid out before me. Then I'll follow him. I'll take it. I'll look in and I'll investigate this a little more seriously. That's kind of what was happening here. He was saying, and tradition is, let me care for my parents until I have to bury my father. Because what happens at that point? You secure the inheritance. Then I will follow you. It's a very different context when we look at it that way. Yeshua responds by saying, let the dead bury their own. And we understand he wasn't saying my father's sick necessarily. But he was saying, let me go and secure my inheritance. Then I'll follow you. Once I get my life in order, I'll follow you. That's really what he was saying. But then we have yet another man in verse 61. Still another man said, I will follow you. But first, let me say goodbye to those at home. Now, if you're reading the King James translation or whatever, it says, let me bid farewell to my family or something of the like. Yeshua says something that really goes weird here for our culture. He says something really odd to them. He says, no man who puts his hand to the plow looking back is fit for the kingdom of Elohim. No man looking at, he says, let me go tell my family goodbye and I'll follow you. That's what we think he's saying. Let me go tell my family goodbye and then I'll follow you. And he says, any man who puts his hand to the plow looking back is not fit for the kingdom. What? And again, cultural blinders get in the way because this phrase, let me go bid farewell to my family, was really his way of saying, I'm going to go home, make my departure, and in the process, part of their cultural practice in those days when a man would leave the home is they would throw a big party. And a lot of times it involved alcohol and sometimes it involved promiscuity. Some things that were unbecoming to a believer. Sometimes it was the whole house, sometimes it was the whole family, sometimes the whole neighborhood would come together and they'd have a party. Sometimes these parties could last a week. Let me translate it to you in modern day terms. It's kind of what the modern day world refers to as a bachelorette or a bachelor party. What this guy was really saying is, let me go and make one last hoorah. I'm going to make one last, I'm going to sow a few wild oats and have a great time, and then I'm going to follow you. And Yeshua says, any man who puts his hand to the plow, aka working the kingdom, plowing the field, looking back at what he's leaving behind, is not fit for the kingdom. Why? Because he can't plow a straight line. He's all over the place. He's looking back at what he left behind, and he's over here, and he's not doing anything really productive for the kingdom. Now, with that being said, we're going to fast forward. Luke chapter 10, give you some context. He's given the mission to the 70. He's appointed them out to go out. They come back. He announces. He proclaims judgment on, tells them what to do on unrepentant cities. The return of the 70 come back. And they say, even the spirits are subject to what we say. Yeshua says, hey, whoa. That's not really the focus of your excitement here. That's not really, in Luke 10, verse 20, he says, stop rejoicing because the spirits are submissive to you. He said, but the reason for your rejoicing is because your names are written in heaven. That's where your pleasure should come from. Not because these spirits are submissive to your authority now, because I gave you authority to do so. We go on, we hear the parable of the Good Samaritan. Then we go down and we find really the focus verses that I want to talk about in this verse that I mentioned kept coming back to me is in verses 38 through 42. And the reason I went through the three individuals that Yeshua had a conversation with, and they tend to want to come and they want to follow you wherever you go. In other words, I'm going to do whatever you do. I'm going to do whatever you say. And Yeshua kind of deters him saying, hey, I'm not sure you thought about that. And then he tells one, hey, you're not going to come to me when it's convenient for you. And then the last one, you're not going to go sow your wild oats looking back at what you're leaving behind. Then we come to another story here when Yeshua visits Mary and Martha. And I'm just going to read the passages and discuss them as we go. Beginning in verse 38, it says, and I'm going to read to you from the International Standard Version, and I may cross over to the King James as well. Not because I think it's superior, but that's because of the way I was raised, and it's convenient a lot of times because when you're cross-referencing Greek and Hebrew words. But Yeshua in verse 38 begins, it tells us about the visit he makes to Mary and Martha. It says, now as they were traveling along, Yeshua went into a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And in verse 39, she had a sister named Mary who sat down at the Lord's feet. King James reads that as says, and she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. International Standard says, who sat down at the Lord's feet and kept listening to what he was saying. Now, it's very important that we understand this phrase, sitting at the Lord's feet. What does that mean? I'm going to read to you a commentary by Albert Barnes when he makes this statement. He says, this was the ancient posture of disciples or learners that would sit at the feet of their teachers. That is, beneath them in a humble place. We might make note that in Acts 22, verse 3, when Paul was discussing himself, he says, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but raised in this city and educated at the feet of Gamaliel. He referred to being taught by the foremost rabbi of the day. That was his pedigree. He was saying, I was the prodigy. I was the one coming up at the feet of this man. In other words, he sat at his feet, and this means that Mary sat at Yeshua's feet. It means that she was a disciple of his, or when she sat at his feet, just didn't mean to I'm just going to sit down and hear what he has to say. No, this means she was focused. She was listening to his words. It was sinking in. She was being discipled by him. And that she was listening attentively to his instructions and was very eager to learn his doctrine. But in the midst of that, in verse 40, but Martha, In verse 40, we read in the KJV reads, "But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him," aka Yeshua, "and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Bid her, therefore, that she help me." Martha's running around. We use the old Appalachian term, like a chicken with her head cut off. She's trying to do all this work, and she's trying to get everything done, and she's all uptight about it. And she says, "Master, my sister is being lazy. I'm doing all this stuff, and she's just sitting there. Will you please tell her to get up and help me?" Now, talking about a few things here. Before we move into the next verse, just talking about this particular verse, he says, Martha was cumbered about much serving. This word serving comes from where we get the Greek word diakonia. Strong's references to Greek word 1248, which actually means servitude. It actually translates several times. That word is used 36 times. It's translated one time as the word serving. It's translated 27 times roughly as the word ministry or ministering. It's translated as relief one time, service 3 times. Here it's translated the word serving. But for example, in Romans 12:7, it refers to if your gift is serving, then devote to serving others. If it is teaching, now I'm using the ISV, but it's used. It's actually, if you use the KJV, it's actually translated as the word ministry. And in verses 12, 1 through 7, I've already talked about verses 4 and 5, and he talks about the various gifts. And he talks about we all have different gifts based on the grace that was given to us. So if your gift is prophecy, now that could be a whole teaching in itself about what that means and what it doesn't mean. Use your gift in the portion of your faith. If your gift is in ministering, and then devote yourself to that. If it's in teaching, devote yourself to that. And 2 Timothy 4, he talks about completing your ministry. Same word. Talks about the ministration in Acts 6, verses 1 through 4. It's used twice. It's talking about, first it's translated as ministration or to the ministry, and it's talking about when the Hellenistic Jews, I'll use that term, it calls them when the Grecians in the King James, but it's the Hellenistic Jews were being refused, the widows were being refused their portion. We know it wasn't talking about Greeks or of the nations, because in Acts chapter 6, the gospel has not even went to the Gentiles yet. The word Grecian translates from the word Hellenist, which refers to Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jews. So the Greek-speaking Jews were actually being kind of set aside as second-class Jews against the Palestinian Jews, if you will, what later became known as Palestinian Jews. Or the Hebrews is the way it's talking about, those who had refused all things Greek. The Hellenists they've learned Greek language, they've picked up some culture from the Greeks, but they were Jews nevertheless. But the point is she was running around doing this ministry work. And she says, "My sister is being lazy. Will you please tell her to get up and help me?" She was drawn away. She was drawn away doing all this work. Now, but something very interesting happens in verse 41. The master answered and said, "Martha, Martha." He said, "Martha, Martha, you're careful and troubled about many things." Now, of course, when he said her name twice, it was a way of speaking to her on an intimate level. at a very close relative level. Martha, Martha, you're troubled about a lot of things. Now, the International Standard says you worry and fuss about a lot of things. He says, you're busy. And she was thinking, her sister's doing nothing. Please make her come and help me. Let her, as we called it in the Baptist church, get off of your blessed assurance and come and help me work. And in verse 42, this wraps it up, and I'll try to wrap it up for the sake of time. He says, and I'll keep it short and sweet if possible. He said, but there's one thing that you need. He tells Martha, he said, you worry about a lot of things. He said, there's one thing you really need to do. He said, your sister Martha has chosen what is better. And it is not to be taken away from her. What has this got to do with anything I've talked about thus far? Is I'm kind of going back to what Brother Keith Wilson talked about last week when he talked about those 3 S's: to search, surrender, and submit. And he spent a lot of time talking about submitting. And every word, I agree with everything he taught. But it came to my attention that there's a stumbling block that gets in the way between surrender and submission. And by the way, look up the definition. I thought, what's the difference in surrender and submitting? Aren't those the same thing? Look at the definitions. There's not. There's a little bit of difference between the two. Surrender will be the idea of acknowledging something to be, and in this realm would be acknowledging something to be true. Submitting to it is that's when you relinquish your will for His will. It's when you say, I don't have the opportunity or the authority to choose what body part I'm going to be. That's when you get to the stage where I'm going to submit to be the body part you have designed me to be, that you have gifted me to be. I wanted to be eyes, but you have declared that I'm a finger. So therefore, I'm a finger. But in talking about that and experiencing the gospel in these 3 S's, the search, surrender, and submit, in the process of searching for and then surrendering to the gospel, once we get to that surrender part, we sometimes develop this spiritual zeal. How many of you feel like you went through a phase of that spiritual zeal, and sometimes you look back at it and you call it the phase in which you experienced Towe terrorism? When you become a Towe terrorist. Yes, raise your hand. Because the Lord knows. He looks upon the heart. He knows when you're raising your hand, you become a Towe terrorist. Whether it's a little bit or a lot, we all kind of went through that phase. But through a spiritual zeal, let me tell you what I've come to understand what happened to us in that spiritual zeal. We tried to skip the submission part. We went straight from surrender, and we thought we're about to labor. We went from surrendering, accepting this is true, to jumping straight into the labor force to do, like Martha was doing. She's running around and she's trying to do everything. She's making sure everybody's served up, and we're doing this and we're doing this and we're making sure we're doing this and doing that, and we're going and we're checking on this shelter and we're doing this and we're building this and this ministry and that ministry. We're doing and doing and doing and doing and doing and doing. And what we do is we skip the submission part. We take matters into our own hands. Instead of submitting to Yahweh's will and where He would have us be and what He would have us do, we take matters in our own hands, and we take our calling, if you will, if that's what you want to call it, into our own hands, and we start to work like crazy toward the advancement of the kingdom. I've got to go. I've got to do. The truth has been told. I understand the truth now. They don't understand the truth. I've got to get on Facebook, and I've got to chastise, and I've got to condemn, and I've got to prove everybody wrong, and I've got to show them how they're living in rebellion, and they're doing this, and they're doing that, and we become so heavenly minded, we become no earthly good, and we're doing more damage for the kingdom than what we are good. What we've done is we've decided what body part we want to be before it's even been made known to us which part He wants us to be. What we do when we do that is we run a great risk of failing to do exactly what Yeshua said that Martha's sister was doing. We fail when we come to that point that we are surrendering to the gospel experience. The best thing that we could do, let's just sit at His feet. Let's sit at His feet. Let's hear from Him. Because we fail to listen to Him. Oftentimes we get so busy, we get neglected. It's very, very common, and I speak to myself as much as I speak to you, to run around being in pastoral ministry work, is to get busy doing the things. And in the process, we don't mean to, but what we do in the zeal of going and doing things and sharing the truth, what we do is we forget to sit down at His feet. There's a very big difference in standing still and doing nothing. And oftentimes we forget to stand still. We forget to sit down at His feet. Because there's one thing that we must understand. That we must hear Yeshua first before we can labor for Him. We must hear Him first before we labor for Him. We get in these great aspirations, and I'll use this place as an example. We get this big building, and we get all these aspirations, all these things that we are going to do, and these big plans that we have, and all the things that we could, would, and should do for the kingdom. When sometimes the best thing that we could do to start off with, to make sure we hear Him correctly, is to make sure that we're sitting at His feet. One of the biggest, most tremendous detriments to pastoral ministry whatsoever, a lot of times, is in the zeal of ministry, is the pastor or minister's family gets neglected. Because we're running around like Martha, trying to make sure everything's done right, and we get everything finished right, and we get it done on time, and all these things, and we're trying to plan some other program before we've even really started the first one we thought of, or that we're feeling led to do. And I think we got to remember that when you sit, it's just like a child. The child first learns what? How to sit up. Then they learn how to crawl. Then they learn how to walk. Then they can run. And I'm not saying we shouldn't labor, but sometimes I know many people that they come into this walk, and they come into this walk, and then all of a sudden the next thing you do is I'm going to go start this thing at my house, or I'm going to go here and I'm going to start this. There's 5 ministries that within 20 miles of them, and it's like you always teaching me that I need to go and I'm going to start my own thing. In the Experiencing God lesson, if you've never taken the Experiencing God course, I recommend you do that. For those of you who are regulars here, we're going to start that back really soon. We're going to do that Experiencing God lesson. And one thing you learn is you learn to look at where you're always working. You don't decide where you're going to work. And that's what comes to my mind when I'm reading this. Is like we don't get to decide where we work. What we need to do is determine where He's working, and then we adjoin ourselves to Him in the work that He's already doing. Because Yahweh's always at work around us. I see all kinds of stuff going on where I'm like, I have a real hard struggle. Is Yahweh really in that? And I see those striving to create an assembly or do this and do that when there's others that are close by that they could attach themselves to and begin and to work in a more collective manner. But they have this idea that they just want to build their own thing, do their own thing, and it's flopped and it's flopped and it's flopped. It's failed. It's It's like sometimes it makes you think, have you stopped long enough to sit at His feet? Is that what Yahweh's really wanting you to do? Have you made the determination that you're a mouthpiece when indeed you're a set of feet? Because if your feet and you think your eyeballs, you're going to have a problem. And you're going to stumble along the way. Because what you're trying to do is be eyes and the feet ain't working correctly. And we need to really sit at his feet. Get in this book, and I'll close with this. Let's learn, if nothing else today, when it comes to that part where we surrender, in between surrender and submission, let's think about have we ever had a stumbling block that we cast in front of us where we let our spiritual zeal get the best of us and we decided we're going to do this or we're going to do that for Yahweh. Have we ever thought about what would he have me to do? What would he have me to do? What is my role? Have I truly submitted to his authority? My role, what is it according to his will and not mine? And am I willing to step into the submission realm with that mindset? Because we don't come to him with agendas. We come to him and say, all that I have is yours. Do what you will. Here am I. Send me. Let's learn to be at his feet and hear, because everything, I kept thinking about Ecclesiastes 3. There's a season for everything, and there is a season that we need to make sure that we're sitting at his feet. Always first, sitting at his feet to see what is your will. While Yahweh's sovereign will is to evangelize the entire world, that is true. But has he determined you to evangelize the whole world? Or has he determined that you're a part of that in this particular arena? Where are your spiritual gifts? Where do they lie? And if we do well, I'll close with this. The biggest thing is that we should sit at his feet in order to come to understand. By the way, most of the time, the spiritual gift you think you have is not necessarily the spiritual gift you possess. The spiritual gift that you have, oftentimes, is recognized by other believers before you understand it. So consider that. Reevaluate. But what we would all do for this body to operate, and I say this body, I'm talking about this body as in this body here at this assembly, as well as all the other bodies combined to make up the one big body. What we would do ourselves well, and it would be a good thing for us, is if we would sit at his feet, and I close with this statement, we sit at his feet, learn his will, where he has put us to serve, through our spiritual gift, and then maintain our lane. Let's stay in the lane that he set for us. We need to stay in our spot and stop trying to venture out into other people's spots and other areas and arenas, whatever that may be. There's no agenda in mind, but maintain our lane. Where does he have us to serve? Let's zero, because he gave you that gift for a purpose. Let's use it, because that's where you're going to be the most effective for the kingdom of Yahweh. And I pray, with that being said, that Yahweh bless you and Yahweh would keep you, make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you peace.